Well, Roy Glauber, welcome to this interview.
Well, thank you.
You were awarded half of the 2005 Nobel Prize in Physics, essentially for the development of the field of quantum optics. And we'll come back to that a little later. But I wanted to start with your childhood. You are a theoretical physicist.
That's right.
And yet when you were, or not yet, and when you were a child, you were very much an experimentalist. You seem to have been an experimentalist.
It's a very interesting question, and I keep asking myself how and where the transition ever took place. And I think it did, beginning with an introduction to mathematics in high school. I suddenly began to take it seriously, which I certainly never had before, and was thrilled with it. I was surprised. I never thought of myself in those terms at all. And the fact that I was able to make my way in it was even something of a surprise to me. And then, when I went off to college, the emphasis in college was always on understanding things. There was no vehicle for experimental work for an undergraduate. And then in, it was 1943, late 1943, early 44, I went to Los Alamos. This was during the war years on the Manhattan Project. They needed people very badly, and it wasn't clear where they were going to put me. But more or less randomly, I think they decided I should be an experimenter, and landed me in a group which was doing really very interesting and rather critical things. But I began asking questions about what I was supposed to do, and these were questions of the sort that any undergraduate might ask. But I discovered the experimenters I was supposed to be working for hadn't been trained this way. They were rough and ready people who were very good at doing the various things that an experimenter had to do, but not at explaining them. And that really got me pretty worried. I thought, good Lord, they're not going to want me to become one of these fellows. So I asked if I could be transferred to the theory division. And they did transfer me, and that worked out really pretty well, much to my surprise.
But presumably your early success as an experimenter, I mean, you built telescopes, quite
That's
sophisticated
right.
nature as a child.
Yeah.
That must have come from asking the right questions as you were doing your experiments. You must have.
Well, doing the right things at that stage. But you see, I think the problem was something like this. Experimenters weren't supposed to be people with much mathematical background in those days. I'm talking of the ancient days of the 1940s. They were people who knew how to make and seal a good vacuum and that sort of thing. And on the other hand, they had not been saturated with mathematics as I had been.
It must have been a bit of a difficult situation, because you were only 18 when you went
That's
to
right,
Los Alamos, and you'd had an extraordinarily rapid introduction at Harvard by doing graduate courses in the turned around world of the war.
That's right. Well, it was an inverted world, all right, and I was happy enough to go quickly, but not always that quickly, because they announced they were just not going to give these courses a second time during the war, so I jumped in the graduate courses, and that seemed to work all right.
Wonderfully free environment that you could do that as an undergraduate, just say, oh, I'll do those courses. Good.
Well, there were no gatekeepers.
Anyway, this 18-year-old turns up at Los Alamos and starts telling the experimenters, or maybe not telling them, but anyway, thinking they should be asking better questions. But it was the sort of environment where you could do that. And people,
oh, yes, very much.
It must have been a marvelous environment.
Well, it was an extraordinary environment during the war years at Los Alamos, because there was very little pretentiousness. The question was just how in the world are we going to get these things done? They were, some of them, virtually impossible things for that day and age, and many of the zaniest solutions were proposed. There were all sorts of things that have never been publicized in the years since, and it's perhaps just as well.
Can you give an example of any?
Oh, well, for heaven's sakes. I mean, for example, in the test at Los Alamos, when the weapon was to be tested, one of the greatest worries was, suppose it's a total fizzle, nothing at all happens, we will have lost the precious fissionable materials. So many months ahead, they ordered a steel vessel to be constructed, which would be large enough, massive enough to contain the explosion of several tons of TNT and hold it all together so that we could pick up the pieces. That piece of steel, that great steel vessel called Jumbo, was fabricated. It was one of the most difficult things to transport across America.
Secretly?
Secretly to the middle of the desert in Alamogordo. And it just sat there and was never used.
What happened to Jumbo, do you know?
Oh, I think they tried blowing it. They wanted to see, just as a matter of curiosity, how much TNT it could contain. And I think they did put some hundreds of pounds of TNT in the thing and discovered that it wouldn't have held together anyway.
Right.
I'm sure the pieces of it are there still.
And you got, and was it an environment where people mix freely, and so you got to meet the great and the good and work with them?
Yes, very much. It was a very free society. Say there were virtually no women. There were wives, the married young people. What people lose sight of these days is that virtually the oldest person in the place was Oppenheimer at age 38. The entire staff was between about 21 and 30 or so.
Was that was a conscious choice on the people who put it together, or not on Oppenheimer's part to
No, those were the people, the older people had been in war work. First of all, they were married and had families and weren't too anxious to pick up and leave and go off into the desert by and large. These were young people, many of them still graduate students, many who had just gotten their degrees. The others had been on war projects for years.
So after spending 2 years there and being part of such a team and having such a success, if you like, at the end of it, you then went, well, I mean...
It was a pretty disturbing success, let me tell you.
Right. So I didn't know whether to ask you about it, your feelings about it, but were they mixed feelings during the project or after it? Or?
Well, they were mixed, of course, during it. First of all, I didn't go there with any awareness that it was a bomb project. They were about as secret about that as they could be. I surmised, because of various evidences that one could pick up here and there, that it might be a project having something to do with chain reactions, and was completely shocked to hear that it already had been achieved, the uranium chain reaction.
That had happened in Chicago.
That had happened in Chicago well over a year earlier. And that, in fact, they were working on a bomb. That was really quite unsettling and remained so for a long time. Eventually, it became a technical problem, which we were all worried about various aspects of. And they were pretty technical aspects. I worked on neutron diffusion problems in the theory group under Hans Bethe. And there were, if there was any celebration at the end of the war, it was at the war's end, not at the use of the weapon.
Mm.
And there are some quite wrong things that have been said about that.
But then you found yourself back at Harvard as an undergraduate again.
Correct.
And that must have been sort of unsettling that you'd been at the forefront of research.
It was quite unsettling. I really felt very little having had relays of people doing computations for me. I didn't feel an awful lot like doing homework assignments.
There must have been a number of you in that boat, or was it actually quite unusual to have come
It was
back?
pretty unusual. No, there were 2 or 3 other people who went.
But it didn't put you off. You just sort of put
Well, it did put me off, but I survived a matter of a few months, and I had already had most of the courses that they offered anyway. So I was allowed to work by myself.
And you then, I mean, your PhD and then your subsequent postdoc program just looks like a catalogue of working with the great and the good. You really seem to have.
Well, one gravitates. Listen, the people who are serious about this business want to work with the best people they can. They gravitated then toward a few particular individuals, and they do still. The general subject, the what shall I say, the ability to do original things in theory, you might imagine arises spontaneously anywhere, but that's wrong. The answer is it tends to develop in certain hotspots where people learn from one another. And Princeton was certainly that.
So from
in the post-war years after 1948, when Oppenheimer went there, that became the mecca for theoretical physics, and we had 20 or 30 young people all competing implicitly with one another.
Right, so yes,
Right
Oppenheimer took you to Princeton, and
Yes.
and then so you'd worked with him before.
Not personally. I certainly had worked in the theory group at Los Alamos, and he was leader of the entire project, but I had no personal dealings with him at all at Los Alamos.
Is it possible to summarize what Oppenheimer and Pauli and Linus Pauling, all of whom you worked with in those years, gave you in terms of their mentorship or taught you about the way to do theoretical physics?
Oh, good heavens, it would be very difficult to say, except that these were extremely poised people who knew well what they were about, who thought hard about things, who were pretty insightful and disciplined about what they would say. And you just tried to pick up from them everything you could. Which is not to say that there was any direct or simple way of doing it. I mean, there were people who worked with Oppenheimer who I would swear developed the same cough and nervous habits. There's a little of that brushes off as well. But,
yeah.
I couldn't imitate Pauli. It wouldn't.
No, okay. But in your own mentorship of the students and postdocs who come to you over the years, who've come to you, do you have any sort of abiding principle for the way you treat them? Is there something in particular?
Well, you try to encourage them and to bring out of them everything you can. One does have very different experiences with different students. Some students have a kind of magical ability to amplify worthwhile things you tell them, and occasionally to produce small miracles. Others you really have to drag along and have the feeling that it's been quite a burden for a few years.
Do you have any criteria that you apply to people who want to join you? Or is it just personal?
Well, you want them to be bright. You want to have the feeling that it's going to be a positive experience dealing with them. I'm not aware that one ever gained anything for the numbers of students that one handled. I really only wanted it to be a thoroughly positive experience.
Yes. You, as a theoretical physicist, you worked in quite diverse fields.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that just comes from a wide-ranging interest, or is it? Do you think?
Well, perhaps that a bit, but the truth is that theoretical physics was considered all one field back in those ancient days, 50 or 60 years ago. If one was a theoretical physicist, that you could say little enough was known altogether that you were equally qualified to work in any of at least half a dozen different directions. So, for example, to do something 1 month in what we now call condensed matter physics, but in those days was solid state physics, and then to work in statistical mechanics another month, and finally nuclear physics or quantum electrodynamics. That was all part of the game. Things have become a great deal more specialized these days. For one thing, to learn what goes on in a field, you have a great deal more to read. And the whole area has become much more clannish. The people in these various sectors represent special clans, one of which you have to join. Well, it was sufficient to join the clan of theoretical physics in the 1940s. These days, anybody who would say that would be thought of as a bit strange.
Is that just is the clannishness just a function of the number of people who are now in physics, or is it?
Well, perhaps I would say it's not independent of it. I don't know. There isn't this sort of literal exclusiveness. It's just these fields tend to develop their individual languages, and it's like having to get on in several languages. There are people who are very good at that, though I never claimed to have been one.
What criteria do you use when you choose a physics problem to work on? I mean, if you say 1 month you're here, 1 month you're there, what?
Well, it's just got to look interesting, as though you can do something constructive, perhaps. There's something that puzzles you. There's a kind of itch that you've got to scratch, as it were. There were a number of those. I did have the feeling, getting my doctor's degree, that I didn't know in which direction to go, and I did try several. And for the most part, those various attempts are all but forgotten now, but they were in their day constructive, I suppose.
Quantum optics is a very good example of an itch that needed to be scratched, because it was so wave-particle duality was known about for half a century and sort of ignored.
Well, the point is, first of all, there was the matter of verifying quantum mechanics. There was a great deal of that went on, and then later the attention turned more specifically to verifying quantum electrodynamics itself. Is it the right theory? And there was a great deal of work in that direction, much of it involving huge computational efforts. And it all seemed to be working very well by the middle 1950s or thereabouts. But all of that work had to do with processes involving one quantum or two quanta at a time. There was virtually no work which dealt with many light quanta and, let's say, the statistical properties of light quanta. And are the question, for example, are different light beams different from one another?
So basically properties that had been interpreted previously through the wave nature of light.
Right. Well, the wave nature of light is an expression of what we call classical thinking. Yes. And heaven knows there was enough verification of that already in the 19th century. So that was an essentially perfect theory. But then by about the turn of the 20th century, it had become clear that light is granular somehow. And there were many puzzles that came from that. And these puzzles, I would say, were all of them pretty well resolved as a matter of principle by the early 1950s. But no attention at all was paid to the statistical properties of this granular theory of light. And a couple of experiments were done in the 1950s. For example, one famous one on quantum coincidences or photon coincidences, showing that in an ordinary light beam, even when you make it as perfectly monochromatic as you can, there is still a tendency for light quanta to show up not singly but in pairs, a slight tendency of that sort. That was the work of Hanbury Brown and Twiss. And that was the initial inspiration for me. I wanted to see what that meant in terms of quantum field theory. And as I was doing that and finding where that led, that was the period in which the laser was being developed. And the laser, I didn't have really a thing to do with the development of the laser, but it turned out indeed that the laser produces a light beam which is qualitatively quite different from ordinary light beams, and then that was really the beginning of quantum optics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And quantum optics has generated fields of its own, but what would you say were the most exciting things to come out of your work?
Well, it's led in so many different directions I never could have imagined. The control, the detailed control of light beams at the quantum level, making light do interesting things that one never imagined doing before. And recently, a great deal of effort is being directed toward using light beams for communication and for computation in ways that were never imagined. Back in those days, I could never have imagined.
Yes, people are quite excited about quantum encryption.
Oh yes, that's another business. I can't say I'm exactly fascinated by quantum cryptography, but I tell you, it's turned into a profession, and there are even startup corporations which seem to be thriving on it. It's in mathematical terms, in the papers, it's all about hypothetical communication between two individuals named Alice and Bob, and I haven't any idea what either of them has to say to the other and why it has to be done.
Let's hope it's something interesting. Yes.
In these fantastically elaborate and undecipherable ways, which are nonetheless completely secret, maybe for that very reason.
Do you ever follow the application of work you've done through, or is it?
Well, in some cases, yes. In some cases, there have been some fine examples. In more particularly, I've worked in other fields, as you mentioned. One is really the theory of nuclear collisions at very high energies. And there, too, I wouldn't say it sprouted anything commercial, but it certainly sprouted an awful lot of experimental work. And you get beautiful distributions of particles as they've been measured. One thing I was very proud of, there's no relation at all to quantum optics, but I must say that all of these things have a certain optical background, which you might find interesting. You mentioned my having worked on optical things. I did some number of things, when I was a kid. So I guess my passion for what was optical continued. And this nuclear collision theory is really a generalization of optical diffraction theory, but it's a diffraction theory for many particle systems. And one of the things I was proudest of was discovering a process in which what goes into optical diffraction breaks up nuclei. So, for example, you can have a deuteron, which is a two-particle system, which grazes past the edge of a nucleus and never collides with anything. Mm-hmm. But the simple fact that it came close causes it to disintegrate. It's called diffraction dissociation.
Where did you see that? How did you see that?
Well, I saw that. It was an image which I worked out mathematically. And that would have been in around 53 or 54, something like that, as a way of explaining some observations that had been made on what was then the new cyclotron in Berkeley, right, California.
So there were cyclotron measurements that these calculations explained, right? In your papers on on quantum optics were published in 1963, which was the same year that your son was born, I think.
That's right.
And you're quite unusual among male laureates, at least, in that you brought up your children single-handed for a long while.
Well, after a period, yes, not not from birth.
But that does somewhat mark you out. I mean, many laureates give great credit to their partners for having helped sort of bring the family along and other things.
Well, my partner did help for as long as she did help, yes, which was a period of about 7 years.
Okay. But I was just interested in how you balanced the family and research life, because I think that it's something that people.
Well, it wasn't so easy, and let me tell you, I've run into any number of women who are trying to claim that family duties are no obstruction to having a professional career, who seem to be citing me. But
now's your chance to set the record straight.
But let me tell you, they were an obstruction. And there were a lot of papers that never got written in that period of a few years, from the early 70s until about 1980.
It's something to be very proud of, but is it something that changed your view of how difficult it is, for instance, for women to have scientific careers?
Well, it isn't easy to balance. I was very fortunate in that neither of my children was any problem of any sort. Even so, they took up a lot of time, and I had quite a few dishes to wash.
On the subject of particle interactions on accelerators, I wanted to ask about the Hadron Collider, which I know is something you've been working on recently a little bit.
You mean the accelerator that is about to have its initial run? I hope they get the beam around it in time. I suspect they've already done it and not told anyone.
There seems to be a small group of people who are deadly afraid of what might come out of this new machine.
Well, if you're talking about the man who thinks that we're going to undo the universe, unzip the whole thing for having gotten the machine to work, that's a very small group that believes that. And I'd say he's a half-wit.
It's good to set the record straight on that one as well, then. Splendid. I think there was one more thing I wanted to ask you about, which was your going right back to the beginning, your childhood. You were brought up in the Depression.
That's right.
And you obviously grabbed all the opportunities for learning that were available then. Do you think the system that you went through, despite the sort of lack of availability of resources, was a better one than you've seen than children go through now?
Oh, by no means. I don't think the system has improved nearly enough. But I went to the public schools in New York City, and they varied. In those days, one moved about the city as apartments were available. It was rather more a renter's market than it is now. So I had the joy of transferring from one school to another several times. Some of them were more constructively bent than others. Generally speaking, when the teachers were young and enthusiastic, that helped vastly. There wasn't any of them in which I got anything you could call scientific background that amounted to anything. I did go to a high school that has since become pretty well known for that sort of thing, but it really wasn't very established in my day. I would say that I think science has scarcely made any entry at all into the education, certainly in my experience, had scarcely made any entry at all into the earlier grades. I think the planets may have finally made their way into some mention in the elementary schools these days, but nothing else has. The science is much too foreign to the people who teach in the elementary grades. That's really the problem. And they have repelled it all these years.
How does one get around that problem? How do you entice them to be interested?
Well, I think it would be good if the people who teach the elementary grades were a little less scared of it, if they had some introduction. And in particular, I mean, I wouldn't ever anticipate any miracles of science education in the elementary schools, but there's a bit of vocabulary that ought to be introduced early, and the beginnings of certain ideas. It has been a steady source of amazement to me that, first of all, in Massachusetts, I think certainly fewer than half, as few as 1/4 of the high schools offer any course in physics. And if they do offer one, that course, which is the first place they deal with the notion of energy, is postponed until the very end. We're spending our lives talking about energy these days, and the kids are never told what it is.
That's a good point. Okay, well, on that note, I think I'd just like to thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to me.
No, quite welcome.
And enjoy the rest of the meeting.
Thank you.